Good afternoon, everybody. I'm giving you my presentation on the Leningrad blockade a little bit late. The Leningrad blockade in culture is often referred to the 900 days, and these span from September 8th, 1941 to January 27th, 1944. And while this isn't exactly 900 days, it's close enough for cultural memory. And I want us to think about this quote that I've pulled here from another Leningrad blockade diary. We have returned to prehistoric times. Life has been reduced to one thing, the hunt for food. Since we talked in class about the things that are separating and dividing people during the war and during the blockade. Here we have a quote from another text. And this is important because we're going to think about the blockade and particularly World War II as really one of the first times in our class that we're getting to cultural memory that can still be accessed to a few survivors today. Vladimir Lyapin, a Russian historian, has recalled of his aunt, the Kirov Bridge was always the place in her stories where she first experienced an air raid, right when she was walking across it. And whenever Kirov Bridge was mentioned, whatever the context, Auntie would start talking about it. At that very least, she would say, yes, that bridge was where I got caught in an air raid for the first time. But that was only the start. If she had the chance, she would tell how a policeman dragged her by the arm and didn't let her cross. How she would say, what difference does it make? I'm halfway across already. And so if we think about contemporary Russians, we really sort of think about family history really beginning with an experience of World War II, and particularly for modern day Petersburgers, a family history that begins with a memory of the blockade. Our guide through the blockade has been Vera Inbar, who was born in 1890 and lived until 1972. Given all of the turmoil that she witnessed, she lived quite a long life. She was born in Odessa and was related to the revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who would be one of Stalin's main opponents after the death of Lenin, and Trotsky was eventually chased out of Russia, only to be murdered in Mexico. Despite Inber's relationship to Trotsky, it was this work during World War II, and particularly her voice in the revolution, that elevated her to a kind of position that would make her, while not untouchable by Stalinist power, still, relatively speaking, somewhat safe because she became such a cultural figure. She was she became a member of the Communist Party in 1941, which is an interesting time to become a member of the party, given the fact that at that time, the party had been purged of a lot of its former senior members. And she would broadcast during the siege. In fact, she makes reference to the radio a few times in the entries that we looked at, and it might be good to revisit those when we sort of think about how we can answer the question I'm going to pose to us today. Her diary was published very soon after the end of the war in 1946, and she would be considered an official voice of the siege. One of the ways that she would end her radio broadcasts is a direct appeal to the Leningraders that she knew that she was talking to, her neighbors, both seen and unseen. Farewell, Leningrad. Nothing in the world will ever erase you from the memory of those who lived here through this time. The siege itself is one of the most tragic moments of World War II, and World War II is, of course, full of tragedy. The siege quickly followed the invasion of Russia by the Germans, and if you know anything about the history of World War II, Russia was very much caught unawares by the breaking of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Stalin really was in deep denial until really the Germans were already in Russian territory that they were being invaded. The Germans had hoped to starve and terrorize the city into surrender, so the bombing targets were random to maximize that terror. In the end, 1 million people would die from starvation of the siege, and 1 million people would die during the siege, and 80% of that would be from starvation. To look at those numbers a little bit more closely, before the siege, Leningrad was home to 2.5 million people. 1 million were evacuated. 40% of those were children. And in 1944, only 60,000 residents remained. We have a number of documents that have survived the siege. And while we looked at Inbur's because hers is in some way the most famous, we have other pieces as well. And we don't follow Inbur very far into the siege. We see her approach the first terrible winter of the siege, but it is actually the later into 1941 and then the brutal New Year of 1942 that we'll see some of the steepest and most serious casualties due to starvation. We see here already in 1941, they've cut the bread ration once more. On a worker's ration card, they now give you 10 and 1/2 ounces. On the card of a clerk, dependent, or child, 5 and 1/4 ounces. So this would be somebody's food for the full day, and this is only a few months into the siege. A few days later, famine is approaching. Our personal reserves are finished. An original Leningrad cuisine has developed. We've learned to make donuts out of mustard, soup out of yeast, hamburgers out of horseradish, and gelatin out of a joiner's glue. Many burning in soil that contains charred sugar from around the Badaev warehouses, which of course was where there was a fire. They boil it, filter it, and make coffee. These quotes should indicate to us the sort of severe physical limitations that people will put under. But again, this is only November of 1941. By the time the siege is lifted in 1944, people would be eating their pets, people would be eating their furniture, people would be eating paper, and there are many actual accounts of people eating the corpses of dead human bodies. So I'm going to show us a couple pictures, and feel free to answer these questions in the Flipgrid. What do we see here? This piece of machinery is called a barrage balloon. Oh, excuse me. And these would be floated in the air, particularly in dusk and at nighttime, so that steel cables would prevent German pilots, from coming closer and bombing the city. Cables in general are deadly to pilots even to this day. Here we have getting to our first spring of 1942. This is going to be a famous propaganda image from the sort of resilience effort, that is to present Leningrad as a resilient city. We see two women growing cabbages in front of the very famous St. Isaac's Cathedral. Interestingly enough, this area is going to be between St. Isaac's Cathedral and the Bronze Horseman statue. So my question for you when considering this siege is, in class we talked about how war breaks natural connections and breaks the connections of one person to another. And how did people try and maintain connection given all of these broken connections? The history of the city is going to extend beyond the siege. And in fact, after the siege, Leningrad will be first among hero cities. There's a couple other cities that are labeled as hero cities. Moscow is one of them. Stalingrad is another. But Leningrad is first among them. So again, we have this picture of Leningrad here. We have Pushkin right here, the statue of Pushkin, which actually does not exist in this space, in this square. And then what do we see in this image from the newspaper? Even today, we have memories and memorials to the tragedy of the city. We see that citizens during an air raid, the side of the street is more dangerous, so that remains. And what's interesting is that not only do those remain in the city, that those are actually kept by the city, maintained by the city, and so that they don't fade. And then, of course, we have a memorial plaque to say that this trace of the war is itself a memorial to all who died in Leningrad.